it's a special surprise. We have Matt Christman from Chapo Trap House. A lot of people talk about how billionaires need to do philanthropy and stuff, and they always cite Andrew Carnegie as an example of a great philanthropist.
Yes, he has the famous hall in New York named after him, and hundreds of libraries all across the country were built by Andrew Carnegie. After he'd amassed his fortune, he decided to give it all away. And in a lot of ways, Carnegie is the model of a good billionaire, not only with the philanthropy, but the fact that unlike most rich people now, he was a legitimate rags to riches tale. He started off as a railway telegraph operator who worked his way up, a Scottish immigrant who worked his way up to become, the equivalent of a billionaire. And so, he endowed, institutes of higher learning like the
Carnegie Mellon University.
Yeah. But of course, it was all built on hyper exploitation of labor. And there were two big moments in Carnegie's life that really put a spotlight on the...
Before you get there, can you explain what was Carnegie's business?
Steel. He became essentially the steel magnate, the robber baron in the steel sector when the economy was being split up into trusts, these monopolistic industry leaders. And he was the monopolistic industry leader in the steel industry, which meant that he ran his own Paris estate in western Pennsylvania, which was the heartland of steel manufacturing. And part of that was that he and other rich people in Pittsburgh, they created an artificial lake outside of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, where they could do pleasure cruises and fishing and the old-timey fun, like where they would wear bathing costumes and play badminton and all this weird stuff that you see people doing in like silent films. But while they were doing that, they were, of course, spending no money on maintaining this incredibly complicated dam system that they'd erected to keep the water together. And in 1889, there was a storm which led to the dam breaching and the entire town of Johnstown, which is next to the artificial lake, being flooded and killing over 2,000 people.
Wow. So they built... That's actually a glimpse of probably the future with climate change, right?
I mean, just in terms of creating, of rich people creating artificial, personal, private habitats, certainly. And when it was all said and done, the responsibility for having done this was, of course, not laid at the feet of the people who actually did it. The Association of Rich People, led by Carnegie, ended up paying a pittance, really, of the amount of, compared to the amount of damage that had been wrought. And of course, nobody ever was prosecuted. That's absurd.
Was this part of the impetus for his later philanthropy?
Yeah, he wanted to get his name back, basically, after being associated with that. Well, then the other one, the one that really required him to get a good campaign and to make sure people remembered him for the libraries and not the other stuff, was the Homestead Strike of 1892.
Just so you know, apparently, at least as recent as 2018, this flood was the deadliest flood in American history, the flood of 1889.
And so what happened with the Homestead Strike in 1892 is that among the workers at his steel facilities, there was a small group of them who had successfully created a bargaining unit and were part of a union. And they were pushing not only for higher wages, but to unionize the rest of the workers at the plants. And Carnegie took the opportunity of the economic downturn of the early 1890s to try to break the union completely. And he went off on a European tour, left things in the capable hands of his administrator, Henry Clay Frick, and kind of gave him vague orders to take care of the labor dispute. And Frick did that first by demanding a wage reduction and the destruction of the union there, and then refusing to allow the unionized workers to enter the factory, essentially doing a lockout, which then led to a larger strike by other workers in the plant. And then, in order to deal with this upsurge of labor militancy, Frick hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to send guys out.
Detective Agency.
Yeah, to send guys out to get people back to work. And there was a very famous conflict where a flat-bottom boat full of Pinkertons, which had been sent down the river to dock at Homestead and to intimidate the strikers, ended up in a protracted day-long firefight with steelworkers on the land, which
That's
led...
like a mini war.
Yeah, no, it was. It was a little mini conflict. About 14 people died on both sides together. And shortly after that, Alexander Berkman, who was an anarchist and the lover of Emma Goldman, went into his Henry Clay Frick's office and tried to kill him. Shot him in the neck, stabbed him, but he didn't die, and Berkman went to prison. So, as you can imagine, Carnegie had a lot of reason to want to burnish his image after all this stuff.
Well, wait, one question. Did Carnegie pay in cash or did he pay in company scrip?
Carnegie paid wages.
Okay, so he paid money.
Yeah, the company scrip was mostly associated with mining operations,
Okay.
and he was making steel in factories.
Okay, so at least was better than his cohorts in the fact that he paid with actual currency.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if that's the standard you want to hold someone to, that's better than his contemporaries in that respect.
So did he leave for Europe, like, in order to kind of stay?
Yeah.
To keep his name? Okay, so this is a Washington going back to D.C. during the Whiskey Rebellion kind of move.
Yeah. Yeah, no, he didn't want his name really associated with the hard business that was ahead. Meanwhile, Frick didn't care. Frick was absolutely unconcerned with his public persona and those kind of things. He was much less effacing than Carnegie.
I was reading this book by Gustavus Myers about the Great American Fortunes, and they talk about how actually kind of Carnegie started the PR industry in the 1900s.
Yeah, for his own identity, basically. Yeah, to make the brand Carnegie positively associated in people's minds, which is kind of funny because at the time it wasn't really strictly necessary. As I said, you had these monopolies going around. It wasn't like they had to worry about competition. People weren't going to get their steel elsewhere. But I think it was mostly about ego. He didn't want people to think he was a bad guy.
Back then, like in the 1890s, like there were no laws that protected union workers. Like now we have so many protections of union workers. It was a free-for-all, right?
Oh, yeah, no, there was no protections of any kind for workers at all. I mean, they were totally at the mercy of their employers. And one of the chief mechanisms that they used to keep workers disorganized and unable to challenge them was private detective agencies like the Pinkertons, who did a number of services for mine operators and factory owners in order to keep the workers in line. The chief one of those is the Pinkerton Agency.
So let's say that I, in the late 1800s, wanted to have a secret union meeting. Like, what would the Pinkertons do?
Well, what would have happened is that if your employer has any concern about unions, he's heard rumblings from, foremen or whatever about people talking about unionizing, or if they've seen union organizers in the community or something, is they would hire someone like the Pinkertons to send agents into the factories posing as workers, so that if there were union meetings, they would be there and they would be able to tell the names of everyone who attended and what their strategy was, so that if they wanted to fire everybody who was at the meeting, they could do that. If they wanted to keep them going with an agent in there so that they knew the whole time and then wait for the right moment to strike, they could do that. That was one of the prime strategies they had, was to just literally send spies into the factories and the mines.
Wow, that is a lot of that's mind-blowingly sneaky. And they also did some kind of like they could at that point the Pinkertons could also do like a sabotage during a strike, like beat up an old lady or something and make it look like the unions are bad.
Yeah, well, they had to. I mean, yeah, you had agent provocateurs during a strike. You'd have agent provocateurs, but then you would also have, as I said, at Homestead, they would just show up to intimidate strikers or kill them directly. So they could kind of come from both sides on that. But the moment of industrial espionage that kind of brought the Pinkertons to national prominence and actually kind of created the detective genre was the case of the Molly Maguires.
What is it?
So the Molly Maguires were a sort of semi-mythical secret society among Irish mine workers first and peasants in Ireland first, and then in the UK, and then in Pennsylvania. And they were, sort of the avenging angels of the Irish working class.
It's like a real life Batman.
Kind of, yeah. And they would have secret meetings, and if there was like a really bad foreman who was giving people a hard time, they would maybe, show up at his house, intimidate him.
Oh my God.
In extreme instances, maybe take a shot at him or kill him, beat him up, something like that. And in the 1870s, late 1870s.
One question. Why did they call themselves Molly Maguires?
It's some Irish nonsense.
Okay.
It started in Ireland,
So and then so
they had a lot of insane names for stuff because in Ireland, of course, there's this this history of peasant resistance to the English landlord class, and so you'd had all these groups of sort of, I guess, some like John Reed would call them social bandits, like organized bandits, but who organized along the principle of messing with and resisting their landlords. And they had names like the Peep a Day Boys and the White Boys, the Straw Boys.
Oh God.
And the Molly Maguires were one of them. And then as those people came over here, the organizations persisted, or at least the knowledge of the organizations persisted. And so the big coming out party where the Pinkertons was in the 1870s, when one of the Pinkertons was sent to the mines in Pennsylvania. His name was James McParland, to pose as an Irish worker. And then after being amongst them for months and months, comes out of cover to accuse a whole bunch of miners of sabotage, conspiracy, and murder.
Murder?
And yes, like I said, like foremen or bad workers or scabs or something like that. And it led to a trial with a number of executions. To this day, nobody is actually sure how much of it was even true, though, because James McParland went on to be one of the first celebrity detectives in American history, and this was the case that made his reputation. And he was the sole source for a lot of the evidence. So honestly, no one even knows to what degree he might have just made it up. Yeah.
Weirdly, Arthur Conan Doyle devoted an entirety of one of the few long novels he wrote about Sherlock Holmes to specifically lionizing a fictitious version of James McFarlane and talking about the Molly Maguires.
Yeah, well, of course.
Sir Arthur, he is a nobility.
Yeah, and terrified of the Irish above all. I mean, at that point.
Of course. Okay.
If you look at for the 1700s, the English would call Irish people wolves that need to be torn down and things like that.
Yeah. They're always in Punch magazine. They always made them look like apes.
For me, it's amazing that without actually having smartphones or any communicating technology, that labor and with the constant threats of death and how it's almost magical that labor managed to be organized in the late 1800s.
Yeah, I mean, they were absolutely against the wall in terms. They had no legal support. If there was a strike, it was highly likely that the local authorities would support management. There would probably be an injunction from a local judge forbidding them from picketing or something. There would be National Guard showing up and siding with the management. The Pullman strike, which was the biggest strike in American history, was put down because Grover Cleveland, who was a Democrat and had run as a friend of labor, called out the National Guard and sent them to work putting the Pullman putting the railroads back on an operative footing in the face of the strikers. So it was the thing in there. Honestly, the only thing the thing that they had going for them, opposed to all this opposition, was just the horrifyingly immiserating reality of labor as such, that a lot of them didn't think they had anything to lose.
At least from what I know from West Virginia, sometimes women would be sold into, if their husbands died, they'd be sold into prostitutions for the foremen or bosses. And so things were really bleak for labor back then.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, West Virginia is obviously one of the worst places in the country for workers during that period. In the early 1900s, you had another detective agency, the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, which was just in the business of murdering people. I mean, they killed the sheriff of one of the coal counties who was pro-labor and had been involved in a shootout with Baldwin Felts detectives in the streets of Mattawan, West Virginia. Well, he was acquitted in his trial for murder for that case, so they just shot him on the steps of a courthouse.
Wow.
And that precipitated the Battle of Blair Mountain, which is the largest armed conflict in America, on American soil since the Civil War, and one of the first instances of aerial bombardment used in the continental United States.
So, how did they? What year was it, and how did they use aerial bombardment?
Well, so it was because this guy who was a hero, Sid Hatfield, it was the local pro-union sheriff who was everyone's hero and who got murdered on the streets. I'm sorry, 1921. He got murdered on the streets. After he died, the workers all left the mines, got their guns, and marched on the state capitol. And they were marching through the coal haulers on their way there, picking up people as they went. And eventually, the protective agency, the local posse made up of swells and middle-class guys, and the sheriffs and local police got together, and they, on this area, this Blair Mountain, had a multi-day shootout between these people. And the number is thousands of people between both sides. No one even knows how many people were killed because it was so chaotic, and it was just people basically shooting at nothing in the wilderness. And at one point, the local militia got an airplane and dropped dynamite. The same year that was used at the Tulsa race riot also. 1921, yeah.
Wow. I have actually a quote from, sorry to go back to Carnegie, because I see a good juxtaposition. Like, it's almost history repeating itself. Like, when you look at how Amazon treats its workers and Bezos and, Bill Gates, and it's probably like some kind of 19-year-old in India who's working at 2 a.m. So,
a little bit of Warren Buffett in Carnegie too. I feel like really kind of putting these I'm everyman sort of cred out there.
So this is one of his quotes when decided why he wouldn't pay his workers wages and why philanthropy was better. Trifling sums given to each worker every week or month would be frittered away upon richer food and drink, better clothing, and more extravagant living, which are neither beneficial to rich nor poor. That's
funny. And I think that the comparison to Buffett is very good, too, because he does do the everyman deal, and he lives in the house he bought in the 50s, and he eats ice cream all the time.
But his dad was a congressman.
Yeah. Meanwhile, he owns, I think, more trailer parks than anybody in the country.
He is a slumlord?
Yeah,
I had no idea.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Vanderbilt Mortgage is the biggest mobile home lender, and Clayton Homes is the biggest mobile home builder in the country. And I, without getting off on a tangent, I used to work for Vanderbilt. It's an evil company.
By the way, where did that Horatio Algiers myth come from, in America? It's so annoying, and it seems like it was never historically true.
That's how people think of the country coming into being. I mean, they think of it being a startup in some ways.
It kind of was. It was the Virginia company was literally a corporation.
Yeah. And a lot of the people who came to the New World, quote unquote, were people who had, struck out or failed in some way in their original lives in Europe, and were able to succeed here.
We are filled with European Failsons.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, that's so that the flag of South Carolina has a crescent moon on it, right?
Yeah, I always thought it looked like the flag what would be if South Carolina adopted Sharia law.
Yeah. Well, the crescent moon there is not for Islam. It is the symbol. It's like the heraldic symbol of the second sun. So in a culture like the UK, England, where a lot of them came from, they had primogeniture, which meant that all property would go to the first male heir, which meant that every son you had after that was basically screwed, and they had to figure out something else to do.
So
in the Middle Age, they would go, be a mercenary, or they'd become a priest or something. And what happened is that a lot of planters' second sons in the Caribbean, where slave plantation labor was incredibly lucrative, like in Jamaica, for example, the second sons who were not going to get the plantation, they came to South Carolina, and they were the founders of the state, were these second sons. And that's why there's that on the flag.
Why didn't they do it? Wouldn't it be better for them to just kill their brother?
I mean, if they were really about that life, they would have, certainly.
Yeah. So, okay, this is very shocking to know that, not shocking, but I'm glad we've established that we are a nation of Failsons.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's the whole idea. There's all this great free real estate and labor to access, and it's perfect for someone who has no land of their own and not really a lot of competence, maybe.
In a way, Eric and Don Jr. are patron saints of the thing.
Dear God.
No, yeah, it's true.
Well, Donald Trump is also a failson.
He is, absolutely. I mean, if he'd taken the money his dad gave him and just put it in an index fund, he would have like way more than he does now.
Yeah.
How do you I don't get this one. How on earth do you bankrupt a casino? You're like you have a bunch of addicts and the games are rigged towards the house like that.
Two ways. Two things happened.
Okay.
With specifically with Atlantic City. One is he borrowed a bunch of money through junk bonds, which meant he had incredibly high interest rates that were very difficult to pay off very quickly. Secondly, he immediately opened 3 casinos in Atlantic City that instantly were all in competition with one another.
Oh, God.
So that's how you do that. Yeah.
Wow, that is like extra incompetent of a fail.
Yeah, no, that's the amazing thing about Trump is that his entire life has been him completely messing up.
And failing upwards.
And yeah, facing no consequences from it. And he, of course, comes to the conclusion after all of that, well, I must be a business genius. When the reality is that his specific position, like maybe his family's network of contacts or his name, is more valuable to other people than if he was to, be gone. And so they just kept propping him up because he could be a pass-through for, I don't know, billions of dollars in laundered money from Deutsche Bank or whatever. So every time he did business deal, he would have like a nice meeting, shake hands with someone. Meanwhile, the actual business deal had stuff that he had no idea what it meant. No concept of what it actually involved. All he knows is that he had a nice meeting with a guy and they shook hands and now he has more money. He has no idea why or how it happened. He's just been floating on this entire life.
It amazes me that his name has been worth anything as a brand after all this nonsense. Companies were paying to put his name on.
Well, now he's the president, so they do it to buy weapons, and the Saudi prince I hear still rents the entire Trump hotel in Jeddah, and it's all empty.
Yeah.
Well, Trump's goodwill can be bought for a sword dance and a ceremony now. So yeah.
That is amazing about how his brand is endured, consisting that it is mostly associated with absolute failure. Not only the casinos, but as was people pointed out during the campaign in 2016, all of his attempts to leverage his brand into some sort of consumer product, steaks, airline, board game, water, all of them failed. So there was never any hunger for Trump as a concept. It really all boils down to that damn TV show, really.
American Apprentice, right?
Apprentice, yeah.
Oh my God! You know what's worse? Have you ever seen okay, so the UK version gave us
Dragon's Den or whatever?
No, that's Shark Tank from Canada.
Oh, right.
But UK had a version of Apprentice with oh my God.
Lord Sugar?
Yes. Oh God. Trump has tweeted Lord Sugar that he needs to get down on his knees and thank Trump.
Yeah, for sure.
That's that disturbed me. Oh,
yeah.
The existence of Lord Sugar disturbs me.
Yeah, no, you shouldn't be able to walk around being a guy named Lord Sugar. If your name is Lord Sugar, you should be like an eccentric homeless person who shows up at a bakery and they give you a free muffin every day.
I know. All he does is make racist statements against Croatian players, a soccer player. He's so racist. He's actually managed to be racist against Polish and Croatians.
Well, the Brits are pioneering new forms of racism against Eastern Europeans.
I hate to cut in here, but is your thesis that any of this is bad?
What is bad?
Living like Trump and living like Lord Sugar?
Yeah, I would say so, because they cause a lot of harm. For example, Katie Hopkins would be a nobody. She's the final solution lady. And because she was on The Apprentice, she leveraged that to advocate for genocide.
Wait a minute, that's where she got famous?
Yeah.
On a British Apprentice?
Yeah.
I always wondered where the hell she came from. That's funny. That is a cursed and hellborn franchise. Jeez.
Yeah. But it also speaks to the sociopathy of Americans, because I know people who've gotten fired. I know this woman who had brain surgery and gotten fired, and she said that those were the 2 most traumatic things of her life.
Yeah.
And watching that, obviously it's fake because these are not real consequences, but in real life, getting fired can be so traumatic.
Yeah, because there's no safety net. People are living, as they say, paycheck to paycheck, which means that any interruption in income could leave you homeless. I mean, that's just the reality of it. That like there's no mechanisms to help people across rough patches. You could just instantly fall through the cracks.
Well, I think that means that the show, like the stakes are actual, like real psychological stakes, because if you know what precarity, if you're living in a state of precarity, I don't know, that's real suspense, right?
Not quite, because you know it's fake, and like those people aren't. I mean, those people, are getting paid by the episode, and so it's drama. I don't think there's a real suspense.
But that's what makes the theme resonant. I don't know. That's just my theory.
Well, it is. I mean, yeah, that's what gives it stakes, is people imagining themselves being fired. But that also is what I think a lot of people were really blindsided by Trump, because when Trump came in running for president, at that point, one of the big reasons he could credibly do it is because he was known for that show and not for, serial bankruptcies and failed business ventures. But he was known on that show for firing people. And, the job of the president is to promise people jobs. Even if you have no intention of delivering that, you talk about jobs. Meanwhile, this guy's most known for firing people. And I think a lot of people assumed that would go down poorly. But I think people, they fantasize about being the one who gets to fire people.
Okay.
Rather than sympathize with the people who are getting fired.
And also the Pied Piper strategy, where the Democrats did not actually bring out this early enough to matter.
Well, yeah, if the Hillary campaign had been even marginally competent, they would have pulled a page from Obama's 2012 campaign against Mitt Romney, where he was like, Mitt Romney's the guy who fires you.
Oh, that was a brilliant ad. There was some poor guy from Ohio where it's like, Mitt Romney came into my wife. Like, SNL made a skit of it that was actually funny, where he's like, Mitt Romney came to my wife when she was sick with cancer in the hospital and said, "You're fired again."
Well, yeah. I mean, Romney had a specific issue that he was a venture capitalist.
And a slave owner.
Their job is to just, strip companies for parts and fire everybody, which that looks bad. Whereas Trump hypothetically was supposed to do things that gave people work. So he didn't have that. And the other thing was that Romney seemed like everyone's idea of a bad rich guy, like a patrician, out of touch, snooty guy.
Well, he did admit on video that he owned Chinese slaves.
Yeah. And meanwhile, Trump is, I think, a lot of people's idea of what kind of rich guy they would be if they were rich.
Ah.
Burger boy, yeah.
And so I think it ended up disarming a lot of the anti-plutocrat talking points that Democrats used against Romney. Even if they tried to use them against Trump, I don't know what would have happened, but I think he was partially, anyway, immunized against them, because people didn't think of him as some other, some sort of caricature of a rich person. They thought of him as a relatable rich guy. Like, if I was that rich, I would also have a bunch of wives from, foreign countries.
Oh yeah.
I would buy the Miss Universe pageant so that I could go in the dressing room
with hot models.
Yeah, exactly. I would have a house that was entirely gold.
You are.
Buy furniture for Cheryl T.
Yeah.
You actually. It's kind of funny when you mentioned multiple wives. Like, some right wing idiot tried to run this anti Jeremy Corbyn ad about how he's gonna get 3 wives, and I'm like, you just gave him the incel vote here.
Yeah, to me, Trump's victory, in a lot of ways, it's the power of cultural signifiers when there's this vacuum left by just a total lack of any sort of, I don't know, appeal to making people's lives materially better or politics.
Yeah, I mean, if you're picking who's going to be more entertaining as a president, and that's the end thing, then that's what matters.
That's the culmination from reality TV, and that's why I support banning reality TV.
It has definitely been a negative impact. There's no question.
I mean, look, reality TV costs $32,000 an episode, and all you need to do is some After Effects editing of clips together to make it seem like there's something bad happened. But it's takes a lot of talent to do script writing. So we don't have historical dramas like the BBC does, because it's not as profitable. So we lose all these things that could have been.
Yeah, and then we get reality shows instead.
And the president of Trump.
Yeah,
Right, and now we have a reality that's even more insane than reality TV.
I mean, it all started with the real world and things, and creating people who act like there's a camera
Can you
on
talk
them.
about the real world for our audience skews younger, so they might not remember?
Well, the real world is the first. I mean, there were before that, there were reality shows. The first reality show is American Family in the 70s on PBS, but the first one that became a phenomenon of commercial television was Real World in the 90s on MTV, and it was just a bunch of young people who were brought together to live together, and they would just film them and their conflicts. And that's been really the model with slight tweaks of basically every non-competitive reality show
that's
and
Big
half
Brother.
the competitive ones. Yeah, no, it's Big Brother, it's all of them. And what it did partially was give people an expectation of how to behave in public, basically, and made people start thinking of themselves as reality TV protagonists. It made themselves thinking about like what they would say in the confessional booth, you know, that
The
kind of thing.
Truman Show syndrome.
And it made people really only respond to those people who had internalized those lessons, and nobody did that better than Trump.
To me, it's like such a strange Okay, we have an explanation for Trump. Can you explain Bolsonaro?
I mean, a big part of it is that
He's like even more clownish than Trump.
he is absolutely more clownish, and it's a similar situation where he was sort of humored by the mainstream media long before he was famous. Like when he was a congressman, he was just a backbench member of parliament, and they would bring him out to talk because he said insane things, and they all laughed at him. And so then when the Brazilian ruling class decided that they were sick of the Workers' Party entirely, they found that, oh no, in the process of delegitimizing Lula and Dilma and everything, they'd also delegitimized all of the mainstream right-wing parties. So, like Michel Temer, when he took power, the vice president after the impeachment of Rousseff, he instantly fell to like 0% approval. And the center-right parties that he represented were similarly delegitimized. And if they were going to go in that election with the goal of getting the Workers' Party out of power, they didn't really have anybody left in the legitimate right to be a viable alternative. The only one left was the absolute clown oath. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth a new Substack, conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Go to historically.substack, is that it?
Yeah, historically.substack.com.
Do it.
One thing I really want to talk about is this ahistorical narrative of conservatism. Like, it seems like there's no, like it always seems kind of reactionary. Like, there's never, like, an actual...
There's nothing they're conserving.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that's because I think Corey Robin has written very well about this. You don't really think of it in terms of the thing that unites conservatism is not necessarily conserving anything. It is opposing challenges to hierarchy. And therefore, the thing they're conserving is the hierarchy. And the way that it's conserved doesn't really matter. That's strategic. The goal is maintaining the hierarchy, which means that in a culture that is modern, in a culture that has absorbed capitalism, you can't be a reactionary, at least, unless you want to be a pretentious, Twitter guy with a Deus Vult thing and you're pretending to be trad, whatever that means. If you want to be relevant, you have to embrace the disruptive elements of capitalism as long as they are the elements that maintain, concentrations of wealth and power and things like that. Even though it's just totally disrupts and undermines all of, the traditional family structures and all the stuff that they claim to care about.
Well, traditional family structures, I mean, polygamy was pretty common until like the 19th century or the 20th century, whatever. And you'd marry your 13-year-old cousin usually.
Yeah.
But the thing that, for me, what's really shocking is looking at all the posters from the labor movement in the late 1800s and the early, and then like looking at how did we get from there to Ronald Reagan? Like, it's like there's a memory hole, something like got lost in the culture.
I think what happened was that the labor movement ended up getting absorbed into the structure, basically. The New Deal was a huge victory for labor. It created things like the National Labor Relations Board and a formal mechanism for adjudicating disputes between management and labor. And that led to the great post-war deal between management and labor that persisted through the 50s and 60s, which led to, the big boom and the working people joining en masse the middle class with suburbanization and the high benefits and pay at factories, high union density, something like 30% of workers were in unions in the 50s. And what that led to, though, is that the trade-off is that they had to sacrifice their radical vanguard. So the people who really pushed a lot of the most effective union strategies, sit-down strikes and things like that in the 30s were communist fellow travelers, people like that, people in the CIO, for example. Because what happened is that the AFL, which was the umbrella labor union, which had a tradition of business-friendly, non-radical, management-sympathetic strategy, in the 30s, a group of more radical unions led by the United Mine Workers split off and formed the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And that was the more radical group. And a lot of those unions had communists in them. And after World War II, and after we were no longer in the popular front with the Soviet Union against the Nazis, the Red Scare kicks off. And one of the big reasons for the Red Scare was a desire to see the radical edge of the labor movement blunted. And the labor movement writ large decided that was a sacrifice worth making in order to get the deals for their members that they wanted. And so there was a mass purge of communists and radicals from these unions. And then the CIO rejoined, which is why we now have the AFL-CIO. And what that meant, though, is that when the shift happens in the 70s, when the crisis occurs, the stagflation crisis, the emergence of competing industries in the former enemies of Japan and Germany that make American manufacturing give it less primacy, the changing of the monetary regime and global trade rules to allow companies to move factories elsewhere, there was nobody there to stop it, because the union movement at that point was largely made up of leaders and members who were used to working with management, who had kind of forgotten that it was an adversarial relationship, and which meant that they were not prepared to resist it when the time came.
Their fundamentally reactionary shift prevented any sort of coalition with energy from the young sort of new left people during the civil rights movement and stuff.
Yeah, and there was a huge. I mean, it went both ways. You had a lot of racism in the old trades unions, but then you also had the people who ended up making up the new left in its congressional form. The people who ended up running for office and becoming a new voter base. They were largely the relatively well-off children of the suburbs, and they had no commitment to the labor movement at all. And so they tended to see organized labor as just the other side of corporations and business and the evil war machine that made Vietnam. They saw it all as a piece. And so they saw organized labor as much of a obstacle to creating clean government, clean, efficient, non-corrupt government as any other obstacle, and they were hostile to it. The Atari Democrats from the 80s and the Watergate babies, they were all from suburban districts made up largely of professionals, and that was the new base of the Democratic Party, and they were lukewarm to actively hostile to organized labor.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, it seems like if you look at it, imagine we don't, things like Uber don't need to exist. We could actually have a nationalized government, ride-sharing platform where all the workers share equally. And instead,
it's just a piece of software.
Exactly. Yeah. But to me, the loss of knowledge, how that loss of knowledge happened is really perplexing. How did we lose all that knowledge about the radical left in America?
Well, it's an American tradition, right? Historical amnesia.
Yeah, I mean, there is no mechanism for maintaining knowledge. There's only pressure to forget.
Okay.
There's no countervailing force. The speed of information, the mass media, and then that turning into now the niche media of the current moment, it's all about energy, speed, and forward momentum. And that means that historical memory is going to be the thing that's least valued and least emphasized.
And that's why we have this podcast, folks.
Indeed.
And what you mentioned about the forward media is so on point, because I don't know, like a few years ago, all these like woke liberals were talking about how not racist Ronald Reagan was, and I'm like, he's been endorsed by the KKK twice.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty awkward when that Nixon tape got released a few months ago of him just
Oh, yeah.
yeah, just being flatly outright racist. I remember there was, I think one of his kids or something wrote an article after that saying, like, Reagan wouldn't want you to remember him that way.
Of course not.
It's like, so what?
Yeah,
Okay.
like Hitler does not want you to remember the concentration camp. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did he really put Reagan and memory in the same sentence?
Yeah, seriously. That's why him and Trump are so evocative of a moment, because they're both dominated by the ability to, once something happens, completely either forget it happened or create a fantasy version of it that you then repeat ad nauseum.
Well, for me, Reagan still seems way more destructive. Like, he was better at acting like a politician because he was an actor.
Yeah.
And he seems like his legacy is so much more destructive, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, no, he's the Dave Thomas of neoliberalism. He's the founder.
His apparatchiks were more dangerous and competent too. And Trump's are all like, I don't know, guys who watch The Sopranos and think that that's, I don't know, cool and smart or something.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine any of them pulling off something like Iran-Contra.
Before we wrap up, I kind of want to get the show back to, like, the main point is that philanthropy is very undemocratic because you're just, like, you're giving the rich person control on, like, saying, hey, these resources after 100 years after die there are still Carnegie libraries around.
Yeah.
Like, so do you want to talk a little
The
bit
Ford
about...
Foundation is a good example of that.
Oh, who was the idiot who made the comment that you can't raise taxes because Henry Ford was anti-Semitic?
That was Larry Summers.
Okay.
Yeah, former Treasury Secretary.
Noted genius.
Noted genius, yeah. Who also in a paper famously said that underdeveloped countries are underpolluted.
Yep.
And that
Toxic
therefore
waste.
it makes sense to pay them to take pollution from developed countries. But
It's okay.
I believe one of his points was, if we know that something causes prostate cancer, but there's a country where people don't usually live long enough to get prostate cancer, it makes more sense for you to expose it to them than to
Jesus
people in the
fucking-
West, where they have higher life expectancies and are more likely to contract it.
My God, that's the worst. Okay, I would say galaxy brain, but I can't even. There's
incredible.
There's so many levels of racism.
And of course, there's the fact that he chummed around with and took tons of money from Jeffrey Epstein.
Okay, who's not
Let's not
connected?
forget that fact.
Oh my God.
Okay, who's not connected with Jeffrey Epstein?
If
Now I'm
you're
getting.
rich, you are, because it's a giant network of wealth, and they provide access for things for each other.
Like
That's
children.
why they're there. Yes, like children. But no, so Larry Summers said that. He said, yeah, if there had been a higher marginal rate on Henry Ford, then he would have had less incentive to do philanthropy and more to just spend it, which when he would have spent more on anti-Semitism, which is hard to believe because the dude
Funded Hitler.
literally had every Ford dealership in the country, made them stock the International Jew. Like, it was in every single one of his factory showrooms.
And he also funded Hitler. Like, it's.
Yes. And then he said, and we wouldn't have as much money to the Ford Foundation. And even there, Ford Foundation is bad. The Ford Foundation exists to create cultural hegemony for capitalism. It funds radicals and do-gooders whose mission is fundamentally reconstitutive of the current order. Like, they went around in the 60s funding radicals whose critique of, like, the society was, like, entirely race-based and who weren't going to talk about capitalism. And so that goes down as people think, oh, they did good work, but they're doing an ideological project. And yeah, they're unaccountable. They get to spend billions of dollars without any public oversight. And they're only going to do that
Like
to
for
keep,
Ford Foundation grant.
yeah, they're only going to do that to keep their money. They're not going to do it to threaten the system. I mean, it doesn't make sense. Why would they do that?
And obviously, for me, that's the worst thing about philanthropy. Bill Gates does not know a thing about healthcare, but because he funds like random hospitals in Ghana, he gets front row seats and decides like, hey, maybe we need to build an app to scan like you poor person, and because they're or something like that, like, and the control they get, people don't understand like the access and control, like. And also philanthropy is failing because income inequality is getting worse as more and more philanthropic foundations are coming out.
Yeah. The thing is, as public provisions are reduced due to austerity, another ideological function of philanthropy is that it can then fill the gap created by that austerity and say, well, look, now you need us. If we weren't here, you wouldn't have this, even though the only reason that you have the money to do that is because it's not going into the public treasury.
And on top of that, it's probably because Bill Gates lobbied for that austerity measure.
Well, of course, yeah. Yeah.
And so, like, the measure of control that, I guess, what is nice to look up with, like, the American trajectory is, like, to look at, like, how much control, like, really very rich people had. And now it's gone back up to that level.
Yeah. We're back to the Gilded Age, yeah. It just makes you wonder what's going to happen next because, what ended it the first time was the Great Depression. And, you wonder what that would look like now.
And on top, like, we have 50 years for 2050, though, basically, if we don't fix climate change by 2030, the world ends.
Yeah.
We're looking at ecofascism. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's funny. People will say things like, if there are historians and such, they're going to look back on this and they're going to condemn the horror. And the thing is, there will be historians because I highly doubt that the human race is going to go extinct. But the people who are going to live are most likely going to be the people with the most resources now, which means that that these historians in the future are highly likely to talk about how well-intended the rulers were at the time, and they did what they could, but it was forces outside their control.
And how the people wouldn't be vegan, and that's why, like, they all call them...
something like that. They just wouldn't stop eating meat, those disgusting pigs. What could we do?
Right, and they'll talk about Bill Gates as being a far-sighted futurist because he talks about population control.
He is the Cassandra that no one would listen to. Yeah, that's how they're going to remember that.
Yeah.
The one thing that the more I do the show and the more research I do, I realize, like, how much disinformation or misinformation people are, like constantly fed. Like, it's like black is white and white is black, and everything they've learned is basically wrong. And even from, like, the founding fathers are genocidal maniacs. So it's a hard battle, I'd say, like, to get a good, like, working class coalition in the future because everyone's...
Yeah, no, it's a huge challenge, and I honestly don't know how it's going to work.
One side note on the Pinkertons, I came across an article earlier today, which apparently the Pinkertons still exist. Which
yes,
they do.
Yeah,
yes, they do. They're now a subsidiary of a Swedish security company.
Okay. Blackwater?
No, it's not. It's sort of like that. I mean, they bought up a bunch of American PI and security agencies in the 90s or something. So now Pinkerton's part of that portfolio. If it's the article I think you're talking about, it's how they're now going into disaster preparedness for rich people.
What?
Is that what you're talking about?
No. Do tell me about this one.
This one was about them. I want to hear what Matt has to say.
So the Pinkertons don't really do detective work anymore. What they do is they do personal protection for rich people. And now, more and more, they're offering a suite of services for individual rich people and also for companies, for their employees, about managing disasters, about being quick response teams in the case of rioting or a natural disaster, and then securing spaces for people in the event of some sort of disruptive catastrophe. So they're offering their services as sort of your personal guard in the event of social collapse.
But why would, in the event of social collapse, like, I would say, like, money is probably not going to be function. Like, I don't understand why the Pinkertons would.
I think the assumption is that there will still be money at some level, even if on the ground everyone's like bartering for batteries and shotgun shells. At some level, at some elite level, there will be a persistence of society, and they will still care what money is.
Oh, wow. And so they're just, like, basically building, like, I don't know, bomb shelters or...
Yes.
And, like, Food Girl.
Yes, and the Pinkertons are providing services to get you away from the riot when it happens, get you to your bunker, and protect it when you're there.
Wow.
So that's the new frontier of the Pinkertons. Wow. From infiltrating labor unions and breaking strikes to protecting you from the apocalypse.
How come they didn't change their names?
That's a good question. They changed it a few times. They changed like the word Pinkertons stayed in. Like they took the word detective out. It used to be Pinkerton Detective Agency. They took that out. I think that for the people who would buy their services, it's not a bad association. Pinkerton isn't a bad brand for them.
Oh.
You know, because if you're in the position to hire them, you're not really mad that they broke up those strikes all those times.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, if they're offering to shoot like the lower orders for bags of cash in the event of rioting or something, PR is, I guess, not really their first concern.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
When you're basing your business model on The Walking Dead.
Yes.
That is hilarious. And thank you so much for coming, Matt.
Thank you again, Matt. That sounded great.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Music for this show is done by Rectech. You can find him on SoundCloud and on Spotify. WRECKTECH.